Well, then, yeah, I guess that's the first inaugural meeting of the XRIG. I don't know who came up with the XRIG abbreviation.
That was
Excalibur
me. I
Research
just made
Interest Group. Yeah, yeah.
we can always change that too, but it
Seems,
seemed to work.
yeah, it seems like a good idea. Yeah.
Um, well, I guess I'll start, and then Vaz, you step in as you see fit with some of the background on where research has been with X culture and how it's evolved over the years. There's always been everybody. First of all, welcome to the first meeting for the X Culture Research Interest Group. It's really not the first, it's the first Zoom meeting, but there's always been an X Culture Research Group that Vaz set up several years ago. And there's been quite a bit of active research done and publications related to X culture over the years. Many of you that are taking part, I imagine, have done some of that research and want to continue to do it further. The genesis for this actually came up, and I don't think Daniel is here today, but he made a suggestion in a strategy meeting the other day or a few weeks ago to have some kind of monthly meeting to keep papers on track, for people to network, for future research, to maybe present some developmental papers so that they can find co-authors, etc. And I volunteered to coordinate that with Vaz's guidance. So thank you to both Vaz and to Daniel for kind of coming up with the genesis of this. And hopefully this will help everybody stay focused either on the papers they're working on and have an ability to present them with good feedback before they submit it to journals for review. But also to talk about, again, the word genesis for future papers. I believe, Vaz, it's the Journal of International Management, European International Management, right?
Journal of International Management, yeah.
Many of you, I believe, are on the edit, or many X-Culture people, not me, but Vaz and many others are on the editorial review board there. Elon Alon, who's been a longtime supporter of X culture and research also for different journals, is the chief editor of that journal now. And there's a special issue coming out, and there's also a dedication that has been
special section,
a whole section for virtual global team research, in particular X culture type research. So there's a lot of opportunity there for good research that's founded in appropriate method to get publications there. So and there's other interest in other journals. So we all have a great opportunity here if we can keep papers moving and not let them just languish, as we're all prone to do. I am, just like anyone else, prone to out of sight, out of mind sometimes, and papers tend to sit longer than maybe they should. And hopefully these meetings will help kind of motivate people and keep people on track to getting those papers out and at least under review, because once they're under review, you get good feedback and you know what you need to fix either with that journal, or when you take it to another journal, it's going to be a lot better paper. So with that, Vaz, do you have anything to say? You're unmute, Vaz.
Yes, so I'll say that research has been an important part of the X culture project or initiative. And so several things have helped us to be more productive here. One, very notably, the X culture research hackathon. We've done, I think, 8 of them over the years. And so those are basically formatted as we get together for about 5 days, usually before a conference, lock ourselves up, usually in a dormitory somewhere, and do nothing but research for those several days before the conference from dawn till dusk. And so this way you can get done, you basically put in about 100 hours of work into that paper over the course of a few days. And so the good thing about doing it right before the conference is because then we can continue working on those things during the conference and add a little bit more time than over the next 3 days or so during the conference. And I see here many people who have participated in the hackathons. So, but now with obviously the COVID-19 crisis going on, we couldn't do those this year, even though we had a few of them planned. So Bill's suggestion to do, or Daniel's suggestion to do some maybe live presentations like this one can serve several purposes. One, for those people who are working on papers, it can be sort of a self-imposed deadline, but also an opportunity to get some input and feedback from colleagues. And so again, I look at the faces here and I know that there are many people here who have started papers and then sort of they kind of slowly went nowhere. And so if you sign up and say, I'm going to present what I have in a month, it kind of forces you to get something done. And then when you on the roll and getting ready for the presentation, you might as well continue working after the presentation and finally submit it. Another reason obviously is networking. Again, so many of these working papers have been dormant because the original author or authors sort of ran into a problem and don't know how to resolve it. And so maybe by presenting it in a larger forum, or maybe in addition to a presentation, we can allocate some time to discussing, these unresolved issues. Maybe somebody will step up and say, oh, actually, I think I know how to do it. I can help you either maybe with the analysis or with the theory. And so maybe new research teams will be formed and that allow us to revitalize, resurrect some of those, dormant studies. And three, I know for some people presenting even in a conference like this is considered, a contribution to whatever they do, in the annual review. And so again, it's an opportunity to say, I see we have 28 people here. So that's more than in most of the sessions at the conferences like AAM or AIB. So, and again, here you have a very select crowd. So I suppose there is some value in this, and it can even be counted for something on your resume or in your annual review. So these are some of the ideas. And so the goal was that it would be not just a presentation and discussion, but more like a more stable research group where people sort of sign up not only to present what they are working on, but also provide honest, useful feedback to their colleagues, maybe sign up sometimes to work with those colleagues so that it's more of a kind of broader research team rather than just a presentation and go home. So for today, we plan to present Bill, David, Lonju. I am on that study, so present one of our working papers, but then maybe we can have a little time, to discuss, perhaps there are some other open studies going on right now, or maybe, for a general discussion about the ongoing research projects within the mixed culture, right?
I think it would be good to, initially, and this will be a work in progress to try to keep it efficient. The idea is to keep these meetings to right around an hour. Mm-hmm. And with one, maybe two work in progress papers that are reasonably well developed, that are presented. This paper that's about to be submitted is already under revise and resubmit at a good journal.
But going through some major changes.
Right.
So it will be almost like revise and resubmit not revise, but almost like a new paper submission instead of revise and resubmit.
Revise and redo, maybe.
Yeah, that's.
And then my idea, at least that we've discussed, is to do about 30 to 45 minutes of presentation of the one or two papers that are well developed, and then have around 15 minutes to 20 minutes for discussion of developmental papers, as we call it, conferences, interactive papers maybe, and then ideas for research or potential requests for co-authors, et cetera, to talk about conceptual ideas.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Vaz.
Yeah, I'll just say, so for those, obviously most of the people here I see are, good old friends who have been using Xculture data for a long time. I see here Mariana, Ernesto, David, Bill, obviously you guys, Lonju, obviously you don't need any of this, but for those who are not working on research papers based on Xculture for now. So you can find a lot of useful information on our website. So if you go to xculture.org and click for researchers, here you will see the list of our, description of the existing data, ongoing research projects, published work, all kinds of things, and then collaboration principles and things like that. And so probably the most interesting page for you will be, at least initially as the first page, again, if you haven't been here, is the research projects. And so this one lists all of the projects that are now in development, not yet published. Some of them are close to being published. Some of them are completely dormant, haven't been touched for a few years. And in many cases, you will be able to see what the status of the project is by clicking on it. So for example, I don't know, multiple intelligence and conflict in multicultural teams. I think it's actually Mariana's study, if I remember correctly. And so you click on the paper and you will see the description here. Yes, so this one is not a very detailed description. So Mariana just had an idea and just literally put 2 lines. But at least you know that something's going on there. But if you click on some other ones, again, let me just click on one that has a more detailed description. So some of them will have more like a 2-page description, and you can see, like for example, this one, yeah, has not quite 2 pages, but it has a much more detailed description. And actually, I think this one was just published, so I need to update the records here. So, but you have the description here as well. And so this way, you can see what projects are being in development now, what kind of data, I mean, what kind of projects these data could be used for. And so one, it may give you ideas as to what you can do, but also you probably will see that some of the ideas maybe that you had, that somebody is already working on that. Like for example, at least once a month, somebody comes to me and says, I want to do a study on how cultural intelligence affects performance in global virtual teams. I mean, obviously it's not a very, original idea, and we've had multiple studies that sort of looked at that relationship. So that's probably not a good idea to work on it because it's already been done. But if it's something more interesting, more sophisticated, then yeah, of course, it would be available. So, all right.
Okay. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Bill, I see Bill Johnson has joined us. Bill, you unmute. There you go. Bill will do the inaugural presentation. Lucky you, right, Bill?
Okay.
So this is the paper that Bill is lead author on, and Vaz and I, Charles Wankel, and Longju Dong now are all co-authors on. I'm going to turn it over to you, Bill, and let you get started so we can keep this thing moving.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask, because it says that it's screen sharing is disabled. So whoever's the host, if they can enable the screen sharing, I can show you the slides that I have. I apologize. Last week, we had a P&T committee meeting at my school, and it was going to interact with this one. Anyway, long story short, it got switched. We had to switch this one to this time, and now I just came out of the P&T meeting, so I'm like flustered right now myself, but there we go. It looks like I can share. So can you all see the slide there then?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So let me see if I can, one side there. So basically, as David mentioned, this is a research project that, we were invited, as Vas mentioned, and I've met some of you, I believe, at the hackathon. And so this emanated from that experience. So it's a great example, I guess, of what can come out of that particular experience for some researchers. And essentially, originally, my background is in innovation management, knowledge management kind of research that I've done in the past. And so I was initially interested in creativity myself, but it was very difficult to find sort of approach, kind of the way Vas mentioned, that some things have already been done, or perhaps it's not appropriate given the data set that we have, even though it's an extensive one. So I ended up thinking that team charters might be an interesting thing to look at. And so basically it snowballed from there. So this is, as mentioned already, this is a paper that we've actually written. I presented at AIB for our group. And essentially, we changed the title slightly, but basically the question is, do team charters really help with team-based projects? And we're using the X-Culture data for that.
You might want to explain what team charter is, because I know it's a kind of American word. Like when I heard it first, I didn't know what it means. Yeah,
that's the next slide. I was just about to say, most of you are probably familiar with team charters. Sometimes they're called team contracts. They're essentially the same thing, and it kind of lends itself to the sort of theoretical framework that we use to analyze the data, the phenomenon. But essentially, they're, as you can see, are constitutional planning devices that teams can utilize to better manage projects by setting expectations and rules up front. So it's widely proffered in the practitioner-based literature. It's suggested that these team contracts or team charters will help with team processes. Primarily, if you think about it, by setting the rules and how people will basically, hey Bruce, how people will basically interact with each other within the team. Setting a team leader, for instance, setting how things will get decided. So whether it'll be majority rule or whether it'll be by consensus, and these kind of things. And so it's very open as to what the team contract will actually look like. But the idea is to set forth these sort of policies and rules for team interactions at the very beginning of the team. And the idea from the practitioner literature is that this helps in terms of setting expectations and things like that, as you can imagine. However, there's been little, even though we use this, team charters, contracts are used in the world of, nurses use it. There's a fairly recent literature. In fact, I think it might not be on the sites there, but coming from the nursing practitioner world. But we also use it in our classrooms too. So again, many of you might actually use these things. Unfortunately, fortunate for us, there's not a lot of actual rigorous academic research as to whether or not they're effective. Most of the research, as you can see here on the slide, is anecdotal in nature and tends to have sort of a low end. So given, again, the data set that we had with X-Culture, it's a lovely position to be in. Talk a little more about the data set and how we sort of measure, what we're actually looking at in terms of our measurements and things. As I mentioned here, this is a relatively recent, one of the very few professional or academic articles that have been written that have looked at team charters in a scholarly way, from McCormick or Courtwright and all. And the other thing, of course, is because we're talking about the phenomenon of a global virtual team, we don't have a lot of information about that as well. So that's obviously the context we're looking at it. But like I said, team contracts can be used in any other different situations. I'm coming back and forth in the comments here because I see a lot of questions come in. I might not be able to see them all, but I saw something about what's different between Microsoft Project. I would say that you can use Microsoft Project probably as a backup for a team contract. And that'll come back to what we ended up finding. There are other things that you can do, and I think that's kind of when I talk about what we found in terms of our results, I think that might be one of the things that's sort of affecting what's going on. The theoretical underpinning that we used, the Courtwright paper that I mentioned here, they used organizational control theory, which again, many of you may be familiar with, since most of you, I think, are management area or knowledgeable about it. So to this extent, we can see team charters or contracts as being sort of a mode of formalization. So it's not quite like an organizational control mechanism, but very similar to it. In other words, it's very similar to behavioral controls, right? Things are written down, this is what you have to do. That's essentially what they're setting up at the beginning when they write their team charter as a team. We also thought that, and this ties into the notion of, well, what happens if a team doesn't have a team charter? Well, they end up working things out anyway. And they also end up having implied contractual agreements in terms of interactions within the team. And so we took a look at psychological contracting as sort of another theoretical underpinning, because essentially this is that notion, again, described in Rousseau here as the individual beliefs shaped by the organization. Again, most of these are from the organizational perspective. We're bringing it into the team perspective. But these beliefs regarding terms of an exchange agreement between individuals and their organizations. So in this way, when we bring it to the team level, we're talking about implied agreements between team members about what they're supposed to do and why they're supposed to do that. And so we kind of contrast in the updated paper to make it clear what's the difference between a psychological contract, which can be implied, and in fact is implied by the very nature of it being psychological. And this is as I mentioned here, sort of adapted from Rousseau and Robinson. And then, as I mentioned before, one way to define team charter is a written constitutional planning device. The written aspect is important because this is the notion of being an explicit planning device, and therefore can be perhaps, I guess, similar to Microsoft Project, except for the difference might be Project talks about tasks. You can set it up in terms of who does what task, but you don't necessarily have other aspects of it like the policies, like I mentioned before, about voting and that kind of thing, which is, I think, outside of Project but maybe in there. I don't know. I'm not overly familiar. I don't use a project a lot. So you can see the definition there of the two things. One of the things we found when we were looking at psychological contract is the notion of rules versus flexibility. And this was the thing about, if we look at team contracts and we think of them in terms of explicit written contracts among team members about what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to handle themselves, that suggests that they might be taking away some flexibility. And prior research, as you see here, has shown that flexibility can be significantly related to project success. So there's some issues in terms of whether or not we need, these things like team contracts, charters, or whether you can, whether that becomes too rigid. And so some studies suggest having contractual flexibility might provide. And therefore, they talk about, for instance, team charters treating it as a living document, which we kind of do, and that takes into account that things change. But again, the difference being the team charter is written, so it becomes explicit and therefore shared. And that'll come again later on. This is some aspects of org control theory. I don't have time to go through it all. Strangely enough, when that was suggested, I had written a research policy paper back in 2011 that used org control theory to look at, I mentioned innovation. So innovation within, sort of, it was a commercialization of university-based research. And so this came from that paper here, this chart here. And you can see here, task programmability is one of the concepts in org control theory. And that's essentially how formalized you can make tasks and write them down and essentially provide them in a formal, explicit way. So you can see the capability to develop procedures, tools, and systems within the organization. In this case, perhaps within the team. So we can basically view team contracts as a mode of formalization. And in our case, the interesting thing is the output, as many of you know, because I think a lot of you actually teach it in XCulture, the output is the report itself. Now, if you think about it, the report is an actual, tangible, written output. In this case, we can think in terms of if we need to control for the processes for the performance of a team, all we have to control for is the output. The report has to be good. We can't structure it in terms of, behavioral controls, for instance, are good for telling people what to do. And we, as management, for instance, might be interested in the output, but the workers don't have to be, and that kind of thing. So in this case, our output, as you can see here, is our case, a written report that's clearly unambiguous. And so if you look at the table here, what this suggests, let's see if I can, is this column right here suggests that all the mechanisms that make sense for when your output measurability is high, which in this case a report would be, it suggests that these control mechanisms, considering your task programmability situation or environment, will all require or will all do quite well with output measured controls. You can use behavioral controls, which would be, in our case, the team charter, but output controls will do. And that's important because I think that means that basically output is all we need, and we'll come back to that. So again, TCs are not necessarily required for performance is one of the arguments that we're going to make. And I've got a little more in terms of theoretical arguments here. So here we've got combining the psychological contracting with the org theory, just a control theory that I mentioned, suggests that there's equivocation, basically. Team charters, essentially the argument being team charters or charter teams and non-charter teams will arrive at the same output given different paths. So essentially the formal aspects of team charter can be overcome by the informal aspects of team processes that are implied within the interactions within the team. And that's kind of explained through the psychological contract. And therefore, I would suggest that given enough time, both types of teams will have similar performance on average. And since we have a large number of of teams in our database, that sort of pans out. So as long as we can get rid of other aspects, such as the efficacy of the team, in other words, the capabilities of actual team members, will obviously increase the report. What we're trying to say is, it doesn't really matter whether you have a team contract or not, because non-team contract or charter teams will eventually catch up. So these are the hypotheses that we kind of develop from that theoretical perspectives that I mentioned. So the first one is we believe that the practitioner literature and some of the other literature, for instance, if we bring goal setting theory in and clarifying goals, suggests that charter teams will have significantly higher process outcomes, such as, again, motivation, clarity of what the team goals are. However, as I mentioned before, they'll converge over time because non-contract teams will eventually figure it out. And what that means is what we're trying to say in Hypothesis 1C is that at the very beginning of a project lifecycle, there should be an impact from the team charters. As we move to the end, given the convergence, then that impact should disappear. The other hypotheses we have, in terms of conflict, what's interesting is because charters basically put forth the notion that these are what we're going to do in terms of conflicts, they almost amplify conflict to some extent. Now, that doesn't mean that conflict isn't always there. And in fact, as you'll see, we should see conflict help, hopefully, or the team charters help with conflict. But conflict comes from everywhere. It could come from, somebody doesn't do their job. It could come from something that changes in the environment that creates, some sort of emergency situation. So we suggest that team charters will actually report more conflicts because they'll be more aware of it, given the fact that they've written this contract that makes it explicit what their goals and tasks are. However, they'll converge over time because, again, non-contract teams will figure it out on their own. And therefore, the last hypothesis is there's not going to be any difference in outperformance. And there is some studies, some of those rigorous studies that I mentioned before, they looked at actual team contract quality, which we don't look at here. And they did find that there was no really significant performance issue outside of goal setting itself. So you guys know, basically, I believe most of you, X-Culture data. This is essentially what we did. So again, through the hackathon, we took data from 2018 to 2019, consists of about 1,900 teams, which is 8,000 and a half students. Essentially, what we were doing is we were looking at in 2018, I believe it was the cohort that was 1B, I think, and then 1B in 2019. In 18, they didn't do the charter. In 2019, they did do were requested to do a charter. Vas can talk a little more about what what students were actually required to do and what they were told. But the issue here is we're basically doing a quasi-experimental design here. We're comparing treatment group of contract with the non-treatment group of no team charter or no contract. And initially, we started looking at I started looking at simpler t-test measures and things like that. Langzhou joined us a little bit later in the project to work on doing some interaction modeling and stuff like that. So we found some interesting things with that. But that's essentially where our data set came from. This is what we found.
Bill, can you go one slide up? Can you go one slide up?
Yeah, this one?
So, I mean, obviously you don't have an opportunity to monitor the discussion, but so people are sharing their sort of opinions as to whether or not team contracts help. And so I suggest before we proceed with our findings, let's see what people think the results were, because it seems like such a simple, obvious thing. So I don't know, those of you who haven't commented yet, would you type in the comments if you think team contracts make things better, worse, or no difference? So if you think that team contract makes it better, then, like less conflict, more communication, better quality, then write better. If you think the team contracts make it worse, then say worse. And if you think no difference, say no difference. And if you think it depends, maybe say, like, for example, I don't know, worse for communication, but better for quality, or worse for conflicts, but better for, I don't know, whatever else. So Stefan says much worse. Mariana says no difference. Karen says better. Kim says better. Joy says better. Sharon says makes better for better accountability. Yelena says makes better in all respects. Sujin says depending on the cultural background. I'm curious to know what she means by that. So you mean like better, for example, for Americans, but worse for example, I don't know, Chinese? Better, no difference, no difference. Would better for larger teams, better. Okay, all right, well, we have, so it seems like most believe that it will make better, some believe that it will make much worse, and at least a few people say no difference. Jose says no difference. All right, well, now let's see the results.
Okay, yeah, that was good. Thanks, Vas, for bringing that up, because it's interesting to see where everyone's going. And there are some interesting things there, too, with the contextual, because obviously everything really is contextual. The one thing here is...
And Bruce is asking how exactly it was implemented. So yes, in the semesters when we tested the effectiveness of team contracts, we told all teams, first week you have to kind of work on that contract, discuss how you will be distributing the workload, how you will be communicating, what will be the roles of the team members. Basically discuss, we provided some guidelines on how to create it, the team contract, and said you have to do it and you have to submit it to us. And so in a follow-up study, we even plan to code the quality of the team contract, you know, the length, the detail. So for this one, we only said contract or no contract. But yes, it was a mandatory required part, and all of them, it was what, about like a 1 maybe to 2 pages type of agreement that the teams put together, right?
Yeah,
so, yeah.
Yeah, I think the actual quality did vary a lot, but Charles, I don't think he's joining us today. They kind of look more at that, but we didn't. Yeah, we basically looked at whether they were had to do it or didn't. And one of the good things about that is previous research, very anecdotal, very small, and a lot of times it was just one class, one instructor. So things like, you know, I was thinking the Hawthorne effect that many of you are familiar with. I feel like that might have biased some of those studies because, you know, one group was sort of kind of paid a little more attention to, let's say. In our case, I don't think there's much of a difference. And they're basically random teams. Just one's 2018, one's 2019. Even though we did find some statistically differences in the population sets, they should just be random. This is actually what we found in terms of some of the, in terms of self-report, you'll see the blue line is actually the one without a contract. So it's interesting here that we actually found, I mean, the one interesting thing is in terms of enjoyment, those with the contract, in fact, in the very first week, remember I said that we were kind of looking at, one of the things we're kind of explaining in our paper is the team project, you know, life cycle. At the very beginning, there does seem to be an effect. Both teams tend to be equally motivated. What's interesting, of course, is the motivation and self-reported motivation is almost always, these are statistically significant, I believe. This in week 3 was not significantly different. You can see here, even in week 3, in terms of enjoyment, not. But in general, in terms of these two sort of process-oriented effects, there really wasn't that much of a difference. And in fact, having a team contract seemed to lower motivation and enjoyment. When we look at clarity of goals, again, we see the similar kind of thing. At the very beginning, blue is without, green is with a contract. So what that suggests to us is that given the work that the contract teams or charter teams, I keep on saying contract, sorry, they have it in their mind what the goals are. So they're working on that. And so that clarifies, that solidifies what they have to do. However, check it out. In the second week, all of a sudden, non-charter teams also know what they're doing. This is that notion I mentioned before about how, you know, informally teams will figure it out on their own and that kind of thing. So in terms of this, and I'm kind of going through different things here, so I'll jump back and forth in terms of hypothesis, but it suggests that there's some aspects of the 1A which is somewhat supported at the very beginning, as I mentioned before, but it's not strongly supported in the sense that team contracts didn't seem to have higher motivation throughout the project. And to that extent, there really isn't that convergence that we expected. In fact, non-charter teams actually go up. However, the thing about the life cycle, where it will be much more positive effect at the very beginning of the life cycle, we seem to find that. Now, in terms of conflicts, and this is also interesting, we did find that those with had higher levels of reported contracts or conflict. So particularly in the first week, you can see here, and in fact, there's a little bit of convergence. We actually started looking this, I have to change these weeks, by the way, because I think this is actually week 5. We start looking at conflict later on in the project. But you can see here the difference here kind of converges, but those with the team charters in general identified more conflicts. And we kind of expected that because of the explicitness of the charter. The question is, did that result in any kind of problem? You know, in other words, conflict can sometimes be good, as you all know, as long as it's constructive and approach. And in fact, the idea of a team charter is to be constructive with that conflict. And so when we look at actual peer evaluations, it kind of suggests that that might actually be the case, particularly if we look at peer evaluations. So you can see here that peer evaluations pretty much followed each of types of groups. except there at the very end, we actually have those groups that had the team contract had peer evaluations of their members at a higher, and I believe these are significantly different. In terms of team efficacy, this is kind of almost an input thing, because if you look at the items, it's really talking about we have a team that's very, that can get the job done. And you can see here, again, those with tend to have a little bit lower sort of self-esteem, I guess, as a team, which is kind of interesting. But all this suggests to us that the 2A that I mentioned is supported, the conflict reporting will be higher. But the convergence thing that I mentioned before is only somewhat supported. It converges, but in fact, it kind of still is separated even at the end. So that's kind of interesting. And then finally, the question that I asked at the very beginning, do team charters help? And this is what you all asked about, right? Do they make it better? The answer is, in general, no. In other words, actually, H3 is supported. This is actually what we find when you do the t-test between groups on both overall report grade, and this is the average of each of the sections in the report, which are very similar. They're almost 95% correlated. But you can see here, in terms of cohort groups, there is significantly no difference between the two teams here. And that suggests that, in general, performance wasn't affected positively at all by the presence. Both teams tend to do fairly well. To some extent, I think our theory kind of explains some of that. I believe, for instance, there are other variables that we're not measuring. The R's, for instance, the R squares are pretty low on these models, which suggests there's other things out there. And one of them, I think, is actual team capability, the capabilities of individual members that will probably affect it. But what was interesting, we don't have a lot of sort of variables that we were looking at in this actual data set. There are a lot of other things in the data set which makes it really interesting for future research. But this is one of the things we looked at. For instance, I believe Vas and a group had already published work on diversity in the X-Culture teams and found a negative effect on performance. And what we suggest, essentially, this is an interaction because this is it's either a team charter or not. And so we looked at that, and what we ended up finding was that there seemed to be some interaction effect. That there was not a specific effect on with team charter. What's really interesting, though, is if you look down at these models here, models 1, 2, and 3, kind of doesn't come out, are all the non-charter teams, and these are their charter teams. And if you look at it here, diversity actually is pretty significant and negative. And I believe, what do we got here?
I think the conclusion was that team charters overall don't matter, but they actually do help a little bit more when the team is more diverse. So,
yeah, that's essentially the take in terms of the models here, is that for some reason they kind of helped when teams were highly diverse and didn't necessarily have an effect otherwise. We also looked at report creativity. This is one of the models that Langzhou ran, and this is what it looks like in terms of interaction effects. So you can see actually here, these are non-charter teams, these are charter teams. Oh. So if you look at here, what this suggests is for high diversity teams, a team charter seems to make a big difference, right? For low diversity teams, it actually is slightly negative difference between them. It's not actually significant, I believe, right, Langzhou?
So maybe when team complexity increases due to diversity, team charters actually do have some positive effect.
Yeah, which is sort of, I saw some of the comments in the chat box talking about other cultural and more maybe individual factors. So for me, what's interesting about that, this suggests there's a lot more stuff that we can actually. Oh, it looks like.
Charles is here.
Am I the host now? Can I let him in?
Yeah, he's in.
I did. He's in.
That there are a lot of other sort of contextual factors that we can look at. In fact, maybe Dave can speak to one, because one of the things that which is at the bottom of this slide here is the notion of looking at high versus low context cultures, and whether they, obviously the hypothesis would be that low context cultures would do better with team charters than high context, but we don't know. What we do know from the data is that in general, team charters weren't very useful. And so the question becomes, should we invest the time and effort? Because they do take some time to do. And we didn't really find that significant difference between them. And in fact, it might lead to, in fact, more conflict, which could be problematic later on. But while charters do affect probability of conflicts, they might help mitigate to some extent, because again, it's a contract, it's a constitution about handling them. And then while we didn't find direct effect on performance, as I mentioned, context seems to matter. And so much more research in terms of looking at diversity, for instance, some other measures of variables that are different in terms of culture and other aspects across teams would be interesting. Using this sort of non-biased sample is one of the things. So that's pretty much it. Yeah, I think this is from the thing.
One interesting comment that keeps popping up, and I think we didn't look at it. So several people said, so we looked only at the team level conflicts, communications, efficacy, and quality of the team reports. But several people said maybe the team contracts have a different effect at the individual level. And I wonder if we should look at, for example, let's say Americans versus the rest of the world, or maybe Asia versus the West, or maybe individualism, collectivism. Could it be possible that at the individual level, people are differently happy when there is a team charter versus no team charter? Because we used only team averages, right? Like we didn't look, let's say there are 5 people on the team. And so maybe, the one from a litigious society like the United States, maybe they do, show higher satisfaction and performance when there is a contract in place. Whereas those who come from a society where it's more, informal, more contextual, maybe, once they are asked to write a contract, they get upset and like, why do we need to write the document? Did we look at the individual level? I don't think we did.
Yeah, well, this is all individual level. We don't have the data in the data set. Subset that I was working with doesn't have country of origin. Somebody mentioned
but we don't look at the individual. So somebody said personality, but also seems like culture may be more relevant. Should we look at that maybe? How come we didn't?
For our next project, yeah, maybe. Well, we didn't, because that part of the data wasn't in the subset that I was working on, and it also gets complicated as well. But what I'm showing you here in terms of motivation, this is all self-report, so this is individual level. It's not aggregated. When I look at the actual team level data, which is when we're looking at the actual reports, then it's at the team level. So the N is what was it? Let's say 1800. So
Mariana is saying maybe uncertainty avoidance, for example, seems like a very relevant.
Yeah, Mariana had a good suggestion, and Mariana, that's similar to what we've been talking about in some of the discussion, because this is as we see it, a multi-phase or a multi-paper stream here, that this is just a foundational paper that opens up doors to particularly cultural value related differences and diversity. It came up in this paper with a reviewer asking about how did we address diversity. And at the end of what Bill presented there, we had a discussion the other day about high context, low context communicators and how their perception of an explicit team contract might be different. And, a high context communicator may have more negative perceptions of an explicit contract like this at the beginning that forces them into a box, so to speak. Whereas a low context communicator may like the more explicit nature of it that forces everybody to agree on very specific things. So we do foresee future research focusing on some of those areas going forward.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. I mean, part of it, from my perspective, in terms of what I did, was I'm constrained by the data that, like I said, the subset that I had. And so, for instance, the only thing at the team level that I really had to work with in terms of, interaction variable or a moderator was actually diversity, which was measured as I forget what it's called, the Vander thing that somebody had mentioned it here, which is essentially, it goes from 0 to 1 in terms of, all 1 is everybody's from the same country and 0 is everybody's from different totally different country.
Yeah.
So it's not, yeah, there's a lot more that could be done, and that's the interesting thing.
And while, yes, we are trying to compose teams in a way where each person is from a different country, but there is always some natural variation. And we do have some teams that are co-located by design, everybody from the same country. And then some teams are lucky to have everyone from a different country. Some have 2 Americans maybe and 2 Colombians. So there is still enough variation there. Mm-hmm. All right, so we have about 15 minutes maybe for other things not related to this specific study, but you guys, I think maybe we should try to add that, maybe cultural values, for example, since we have them, and see if there is any difference in, for example, satisfaction or conflict or something like that. So, but Dave, did you want to talk about some generic, general stuff not related to this study?
Well, in general, I mean, for this first meeting, it would be good to get some feedback. We've had some on the chat, and I mentioned on the chat that I've had some people email me that they would like to present in the future. Some of their papers are more developmental and conceptual, and what we would like are some volunteers going forward to present papers that are farther along, a little bit like this one at the beginning. But I want to find a balance. I did get a comment from somebody that said that they didn't want this to just be like a conference.
Yeah.
And I understand that. So what we'll try to do in the future, I think Malika sent me a suggestion saying, to try to make it, or not to try to make it, but suggesting that maybe we do a survey at the beginning, or the questions related to the research about what they think, which I think would be a good idea to make it a little more interactive. But if anybody has suggestions, either here right now, or if they want to email them, or I'm going to try to put together a little Qualtrics survey for everybody that we can send out and get some feedback on what people really want from this. We can't be everything to everybody, but we can try to make this as productive as possible with the hour that we have. Yeah. So for this meeting, I'd like to open it up to anybody who has suggestions, or if they really want to talk about something developmental and they're looking for co-authors, let's say, to go ahead and
Dave, if I may make a quick announcement. So on that special journal section, International Journal of European Journal of International Management, Stefan Gershevsky is actually here, and he is an associate editor, but also is responsible for managing this section. But so what that is, so the idea is that there may be maybe a couple of papers based on X-Culture data to appear in the journal in each issue. And so they can be full-length papers or maybe research notes. And so it can be something simple without the data, without the theory, but perhaps maybe you observed some interesting relationship. Like, for example, some of those research notes we're working on now is, like, for example, men versus women in global virtual teams. No preconceived hypotheses, simply looking at what the differences are. Are men more, prone to conflict or prone to, being satisfied, or whatever, the differences are. So it can be something as simple as that, or a full-scale paper with the proper hypothesis, theory development and hypothesis tests. And so, again, that would be a nice outlet if you wanted to try your luck. We are about to enter the winter break, and so you can look at that. So if you need X-Culture data, we can always schedule a meeting, select the data that you need, send you the data, and, go away. I'm not sure if, Stefan, if you want to add a little bit more about that special issue, since you are responsible for making those decisions. So in case somebody's interested to submit the papers.
I'm just turning on my camera. Yes. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I was a bit late to your presentation, Bill and David, but about the special issue about Egypt, it's actually not only me. There's also, of course, Vaz, he's the guest editor, and I think Alfredo is here as well, Alfredo Jimenez, and Ursula Ott. I don't know if she's here too. So the four of us, we are basically on a continuing basis. We are looking for any articles, as Vaz said, either conceptual, short research notes, as well as empirical papers, using the X-Culture database. And we've sent out a call for papers a few weeks ago through the AIB list. If you haven't received the call, I could probably type it in the chat box so you can have the link. It is quite straightforward. There's a lot of, we kept it deliberately very broad. So it's anything related to global virtual teams, experiential learning, leadership, free riders, conflicts, anything that is using basically the X-Culture data. And let's see, we hope we have good submissions. Obviously, we are aware EGIM is probably not the highest ranked journal in the world. So we can't compete with the likes of CHIPS or IBR or JWB, but I think we do have a very strong editorial board with a lot of X-Culture editors like Vas and Alfredo, and they're all now senior editors like myself. And obviously also the editor-in-chief, Ilan Allen, he has a very strong profile in IB. And we are really pushing hard now to move up in terms of the ranking of the journal. Right now, I think we are ABS 1, but to be honest, I believe we should be at least ABS 2. So hopefully we will go up and actually we do have quite a good impact factor. The latest impact factor was 2.145, which is reasonable for ABS 1-star journal. Mm-hmm. And I think Ilan Allen, he's planning some paper development workshops next year for EBA conference, something like that. So hopefully we will increase the awareness of the journal. It may not have the best reputation, and that's also potential because of the publisher InterScience, which is not the most user-friendly and most professional publisher compared to, say, Elsevier and the other more advanced publishers. But yeah, I think I would invite everybody who is working in X-Culture to collaborate with each other. I mean, we are a very open community. I attended the research hackathon last year, which was very good in Odense in Denmark. Unfortunately, as we all know, we are now in COVID, in a new COVID world, so it's a little bit more difficult to collaborate. But I think I'm sure I'm not participating in X-Culture this term because I'm not teaching X-Culture related content, but I'm sure Vas, he's got many initiatives with the webinars. I remember those. So yeah, I think so it was a bit a long rant for me maybe, but just to give you the background about the journal, because some of you may not be familiar with European Journal of International Management. It's not an A-star journal, but we are moving up, and there's some good developments in terms of the editorial board. I also now remember we have some people from HR like Fabian Fröse from University of Göttingen. He is now senior editor, and they just joined recently. So there's a lot of movement going on, which is quite good. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan. That I would encourage anybody to, if they have a paper that's reasonably well developed, to go ahead and submit it to that special issue or to the European Journal of International Management. It's a great thing that they've done to set this up and organize to support this type of research. You know, one question I would have too, at least for my interest, is this: we can use a few minutes in every meeting for people that, if anybody has recently published something that is either in press or has just recently been published. I think everybody here, I would certainly like to know papers that are out there that have been accepted or have just recently been published in the last year or so. So if anybody has something like that to announce or to just tell us about, then go ahead.
My worry is that it may take too much time. So
oh, well,
I know
yeah.
Only the studies that I know, we've had probably about a dozen studies based on the X-Culture data this past year. So, and then have quite a few R&Rs and other stuff. Mariana,
maybe we can survey that over the time, and then we can kind of announce it briefly at the end for people to go look at those papers, or because it can help people that are researching to look at those papers, their suggestions, where they went with it, and what they're suggesting for future research and things like that. It could help.
If I may, since people are asking about the data, I can show you kind of how to go about it, sort of what the steps should be. So if you would like to do research using X-Culture data, probably the best way would be step one, go to xculture.org. And I would still go back to that site that I just showed you, or page where you have the ongoing projects listed. So I'm not sure why it's so slow here, but when you go for researchers, so your first step will be to look at the ongoing research projects. That will give you a pretty good idea as to what's being done now, and so you can see better where you can fit with your ideas. There may be some studies that you really like, and if you see that they're still in development, maybe you can even reach out to the lead author and see if you can join as a co-author, if you can bring something new, or maybe you have a new study of your own. Then when you go to the data page, here you will see the code books for the data. So we measure data at the individual level, at the team level. We have data related to the university, data related to the professor. And so for each of those, it's a separate Excel file. And you can literally click here and download the data and see what that file looks like. And so I'll show you just as an example, for example, the individual level code book. So the file will look something like this. It's huge. It has over 2,000 variables, but you will be able to see what kind of data we have at this time in our database. And so sorry for the color coding here, but yeah, you will see, like, for example, you will have for each of the variables, you will have the topic, like for example, demographics, acquaintanceship, whatever we measure, conflicts, and so on and so on. Communication, then you have a little bit more details on each of those variables, the variable name in the actual data set. But then for each of those, you will have the actual question. This is, exactly how the question is used in the survey. For example, how frequently did you communicate with your team in the last 7 days? And not communicated, communicate. So there is a typo there. And so on and so on. And so for each of these questions, you actually have the full question exactly like it appears in the survey. Then you also have the scale. Like sometimes it's a Likert type scale from never to always. Sometimes it may be something more like a percentage. Sometimes it's true false. Depending on what the question is, you can find those the scale here. Then if it's an established instrument, you will see which one it is. So you will have the actual name of the instrument, like for example, Dorfman and Howell cultural values. So, and then if you scroll further to the right, you will see information when this instrument or these data were collected. As you will see for some of the variables, like for example, we have here cultural values, it was measured virtually every semester. For others, like for example, cultural values using the Schwartz scale, somebody mentioned the Schwartz, I believe it was Doug. So we used it in 2017 and 2018. It didn't correlate with anything, so we stopped using it. Instead, now we use primarily U. Or for example, if you look at emotional intelligence, we measured almost every semester. And so we have a file like this for each level of analysis. And again, going through these variables may take some time because like for the individual level, it's literally more than 2,000 rows. And just reading these questions will take a long time, but it will give you a pretty good idea what kind of data we collect. Like somebody, for example, was talking about trust. So you just can, look for trust. Like if you go here, you see that we have, well, that's just something trust related to. So that's not the type of trust that you want. But yeah, for example, trust of foreign companies, that's not the trust that you want. But at some point there will be their trust, how much trust do you have in your Swift trust? That's the propensity to trust strangers. But then you have all kinds of measures related to trust in the team. So, how much do you trust your team members, and, all of these measures, different scales in different semesters. So having seen that, you probably will have a pretty good idea what kind of data are available. And from that point on, you can then either tell me which ones you need and we'll prepare those for you, or we can schedule a separate meeting where you will kind of describe the study in more details, what you have in mind, and we will select the variables together for you. Because what happens sometimes when still people go based on just the variable names, sometimes they choose, like, for example, they need trust and they choose Swift trust, which is not the type of trust they wanted. It's a more kind of propensity to trust strangers. Or sometimes they may miss a relevant variable because the name didn't make sense and people didn't realize that it's exactly what they needed. So sometimes it's more efficient just to connect together, spend half an hour going through that together, and we will prepare the data for you. Sometimes if you have a good study idea, but we don't have the data yet, then maybe we can collect those data for you. Again, it has to be sort of related to what we do. Like for example, a few weeks ago, somebody wanted me to track sleep of our students. ask students to record each morning how many hours they slept. The hypothesis was that the more people sleep, the better they perform. I had to say no to that because that was a little too kind of distant from what we do. And like a few months ago, somebody wanted to do a study on diet and how that relates to all kinds of things. Again, a guy from not even a business school, so it was something like dietitian, and he believes that what we eat affects how many conflicts we have. So I felt that that was a little too far, off from what we normally do. But if it's more like on teams or international business or, interactions among people, if it's an interesting study, we may be able to collect the data for you as long as it's not too much. Again, I usually get or often get requests where people say, could you please collect those data for me? Like, for example, in an ongoing discussion with a professor from MIT. So she calls me and says, I've heard about your project. I saw your TED Talk. Can we maybe collect some data for my study? I'm like, oh, MIT, cool. So sure, we can collaborate. And she says, it's a very short survey. It's only 182 questions, and I need it measured only every week. I'm like, okay, well, I'm not sure if we can do that. And so now we're looking at some of those data we already have. Like she wanted to have something on communication, on leadership, and we kind of have not her scale, but something close enough. And so, but yeah, no, 182 items every week, that's not a quick short survey. But if it's something more reasonable, then yes, it should be doable, and probably we will be able to work out something. So, and then yes, some of the projects, if you're not, let's say, not very strong in, for example, methods, we will be able to match you with someone who is. For example, Lonju here is smiling, so he's been our go-to guru for the data analysis, and so he's been running analysis for dozens of studies. If you need someone who is more maybe maybe theory sort of, prepared, again, we have people that we can refer you to who may help you with the theoretical parts. There are some people who are very good writers, and so we actually had a few studies where we invited some co-authors specifically to do the writing because none of us felt comfortable, at least at that time, to do the writing. So again, if needed, we can match you with some people. And I see here Theo, for example, so Charles and then Theo in the background. If needed, we can even, yes, we can even sometimes, like, for example, we have a couple of ongoing projects with Charles, where Charles has some graduate assistants who are available to do some perhaps not really super complex work, but work that is a little bit more, like when you need to code those team charters. So Charles recruited Theo. Theo is managing like 6 graduate assistants, and they're literally reading those charters and grading them for quality and thoroughness. And so in this case, again, like we wouldn't have that manpower to do it without Charles. And then Charles is lucky to have Theo, who is managing the project, but then there are several other students who do it. So sometimes we can even make arrangements like that when it's needed to help and get that study out. So as long as you're interested in doing research, there will be ways to collaborate, ways to get the data, ways to help you with whatever kind of needs you have, and hopefully get those studies published.
Okay, well, I think, we've gone a little bit over time here, but it's not bad. I think the timing's been good. And I will follow up and speak with Vaz and follow up on this meeting. Right now, the plan is to have these meetings monthly. It's, after the survey, we'll decide when and how. But right now, I think the concept would be to have them basically on the first Friday of every month. At the same time with the same link. We want to make this as simple and easy as possible for everybody to know when they're happening. So we will be in further contact. We have now a list of people who registered for this. So we have a core interest group that we can set up to communicate with directly. And hopefully make this productive for everybody on a monthly basis and move forward with this and keep it interesting.
Yeah. 2 more modes of collaboration that becoming very common. Again, maybe it would be of interest to someone, and this is a good platform. So we see a lot of sort of research visits lately. So some people, like, for example, my university has hosted several ex-culture professors for up to a semester who came here as visiting scholars. And despite COVID, we are now working on a couple more for whenever it's over. Unfortunately, we had to cancel one. Mariana's graduate student was going to spend some time at my school in 2020, and we rescheduled it, but it looks like, it may be too late by the time we can travel. But we're already making arrangements with a few professors for 2022 or maybe 21 late year, so we'll see how things go. I know Alfredo, for example, has been teaching in Australia and Ecuador, again, through professors he met through XCulture. So there may be some collaboration of opportunities of that kind. And two, we have a lot of graduate students who are using XCulture data for dissertations, as well as several professors, teachers, instructors who didn't have the PhD, but now went to school. And I think we at this time have 4 of them, if I remember correctly, who are doing their PhD while teaching. There is one in Colombia, one in the United States. And so they're using XCulture, again, to kind of power up their dissertation with data. Again, if any of you may be, working with graduate students, or maybe are graduate students yourselves, you have limited time to conduct your dissertation research. And again, that's where XCulture's data may be useful, because you don't have to go through the data collection. All right.
Okay. With that, I think we can end the meeting. Vaz, you have anything else, or is that?
No, we have the recording. We'll share that, and let's decide on the future dates, and maybe get more input from the participants in terms of the format and the content of these meetings to make them most useful. And all I can say is that I hope that soon enough we'll be back to face-to-face hackathons and meetings, because those tend to be very productive too, but it probably will be another half a year before we can do more of those.
They're more fun too.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for everybody for showing up. This was actually a bigger turnout than, or we didn't know what kind of turnout we would have. So I think it's been a very healthy turnout, and the feedback in the chat was excellent. And we will refine this going forward and keep it interesting, so that we can all move forward with good ideas and a place to talk about our research.
And I'm not going to point fingers, but I see a few faces here that started papers, studies, and then I haven't heard from them for a long time, so I'm not sure if they're dormant or not. But we are moving into a winter break, time to revitalize them, so maybe we can still get them out sometime soon. So,
well, maybe this is a wake-up call.
And they are smiling, so they know who I'm talking about. All right. Okay. See you guys later.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, David.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.